It's a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Hélène Cixous. It's our dream come true to have Hélène with us here in London. Ever since we conceived of the marathon, it's been our dream to have Hélène as a participant. Born in Oran in Algeria, she's a writer, a poet, a philosopher, a literary theorist, a professor, one of the great voices of literature of our time. Among her many books of fiction, theater is A Real Garden in 2010, Wales with Jacques Derrida, 2001, So Close in 2009, Hemlock in 2011, and more than a dozen books of essays and critical texts. For today, for the Garden Marathon, Hélène will be reading from her essay Vrai, Jardin and her books Philippines and So Close, and this reading will then be followed by a conversation between Hélène and I. A very warm welcome to Hélène Cixous.
I live on the hypothesis that there would have been one single huge garden from the beginning of times whose circle-shaped structure, enclosure, would hold a set G of gardens which have whirled about since time immemorial and alight here and there in the instant of a foreign garden. I have always been accompanied with different gardens, real gardens, betraying gardens, beginning with the first garden, that is the first paradise lost, of course, in my life, which was inscribed inside the city of Oran in Algeria. That's my native town. And this garden was called Le Cercle Militaire, the military circle. And it was a circle, and it was military, and it was full of soldiers. This is the first testimony that I received, or news that I received from that originary Garden of Gardens. I went in unsuspectingly. It was a real garden. Right from the gate, one could see that the earth existed. Then the gate gently closed itself, and one was in the garden. Outside, and quite far away, people were going to war. Bombs were falling and shaking the canvas of the tent. They hadn't called it the sky for a long time, because from down here, you could see that beyond the walls, it was being torn to shreds. The earth smelled good. I had a name. The city had a name, and the whole world had one, except the garden, which was just called the garden because it was the only one. Since nobody called me, my name wasn't used anymore. For a while, a few years, I said it aloud some days, just in case things changed and people began to speak to each other again. To tell the truth, I didn't believe this, but a vague sort of loyalty went on dictating its laws to me. So I never out loud admitted that I was happy to have gone into the garden precisely because it didn't have a name, and except for the Coleopteran, the Lepidopteran, the keepers of the paths, the nursemaids, and the children, I was alone. I hadn't always been alone. I must have been with someone, maybe inside even, since I had a navel in the middle of my belly. With your bare eyes, you could see this. But maybe it wasn't a navel. I wasn't so sure about that anymore, since the day a nursemaid went past me and said that the keepers shouldn't leave such trash lying around. And she jabbed the tip of her umbrella into the eye of my navel as she spoke, and she poked little with twisty prods all over me. This hurt physically and mentally. I kept a piercing little pain in my thingamy, and especially an unbearable doubt that infected my whole universe in the end, from right to left and from bottom to top, as well as the network of my thoughts all through time. Since I didn't remember having been anywhere else, what was outside or what was behind me when I entered the garden, and since, aside from the gate's creak, which I could conjure up whenever I felt like it, I could hear nothing behind me, nothing at all, except from time to time the bombs and the maids. Except the little exhalations of the earth, I began to fear the worst. In a world where they could treat me like this, anything could happen. I no longer dared remember I'd had a name, fearing it might come back to me and might be a name like trash, or another of those names that would again diminish me. I no longer dared think of myself or of the maids. I kept seeing the umbrella, which swelled up as it came down over me. And I wanted to hide, but I couldn't move fast enough. Then it was too late, and I heard the maid. If it hadn't been for the umbrella, I might have thought she was speaking of someone else, but it was really me she was talking about, and I had to go on listening right to the end, since it was as if I was nailed to the ground. One more detail to show the horror of my situation. This nurse stood straight up over me, so that her white mass filled my entire field of vision, and I got an eyeful of her milky opacity. To this circumstance, I attribute the aggravation of my myopia, but maybe I'm wrong. I've never been able to see people clearly. It's a selective myopia. I can make out lines, perspectives, objects in space or isolated, 100%. And I have photographic vision for plants and insects. It's people I see badly. I mean the human beings, although I'm able to distinguish between the maids in white, the keepers in blue, and the clumps of children who are smaller than the whites and the blues, and whose colors are much brighter and more varied. To come to the point, I began to doubt so sadly that I started to regret having forgotten my name. Then, as I could see less and less, I started to think of the future. Finally, since nobody called me anymore, and not even trash, nothing at all, I started to feel lonely. I started thinking about the bombs, about outside, about what must have been behind me when I was standing in front of the gate to the garden. I started to desire and to believe, then to pray. Not knowing any prayers, I invented one. It was a simple prayer, and to reinforce it, sometimes I made sacrifices, the way I saw the children doing. I made a little heap of cricket legs and butterfly wings, which I arranged in the shape of flowers, with stamen legs and petal wings, and I prayed, "Come, come, come and find me, Mr. Grace, please come, come." Sometimes I sucked on a cricket as I was praying, and that calmed me. 0. One day, a keeper going by says to his co-worker, they kept everything and kept one another too, "Do me a favor and get that thing out of here." I felt less pain than for the nurse. First of all, because it wasn't the first time. They'd shown they despised me. Next, because I know from experience that the keeper's language is pretty basic. If I was a that, it meant nothing. I could be anything. Furthermore, they hadn't touched me nor moved me, so maybe it wasn't me they were talking about. All the same, in my heart of hearts, I forced myself to acknowledge the regressive process. Once I was still on the edge of the animal kingdom. Now I was being pushed back to the indefinable. I could have proved my existence and my worth had I felt like it, and maybe I would have done so, either by speaking up loud and clear or by penning a letter of protest, which tempted me, but also bothered me because I didn't know how to sign. But in any case, I didn't need to ponder this long, for I soon noticed there was not a direct object of disgust, merely the pretext for bickering between two beings who'd probably never cast so much as a glance in my direction. Not daring to light into each other with their sticks for fear of hurting themselves, the garden's keepers took to psychological maneuvers. I was just a pawn on their chessboard. Every day it was, "Get it out of here or I make mincemeat of you," which at the beginning scared me, then little by little left me cold. Finally, on the verge of indifference, gave me the idea of getting back at them by letting them think they were coming for me soon, which would deprive them of me as an intermediary. I had the pleasure of telling them this to their two faces and seeing them at long last look at me. I must emphasize that I'd been preparing my offensives for some days, and each of my words was weighed and linked to the others in a calculated mixture of irony and of nonchalance. I declared, "Rest assured, gentle keepers, that henceforth I shall take care not to show myself to you outside your on-duty hours, for any professional reason whatsoever, even should it appear to me urgent. Rest assured that I myself shall get that out of here, and that I should never ever have allowed myself to linger had my father not been supposed to come for me soon. Had they begged me to stay, I'd have departed without haste, but they didn't have the time, and I didn't either. A flock of white maids fluttered and peeped between us, pursued by a swarm of chirping, whistling children, throwing stones at them. They could have recruited me. I'd have rejoiced and picked up the nearest stones, but they didn't acknowledge me. I was going to feel sad when the two keepers began shouting, waving their forearms in all directions, "There he is, there he is." Meanwhile, my declaration had impressed me as much as them. When I told them my father was coming, I didn't believe it. Father was a metaphor. But I said it with so many rich words, they took my declaration literally, and I started to keep a watch out, not only on the garden and one another, but also on the surroundings. By dint of keeping their eyes peeled, they ended up believing they saw him coming. Where? Over here, no, over here, no, over there, no, over here, here, everywhere, in short. Whence the swiveling of trunks, arms, and the vagueness of their information. In any case, they thought they saw him. I believed it my duty to believe them. I couldn't trust my eyes, since the space beyond my outstretched hands looked like a sheet of fresh plaster. I wasn't even sure that it was the nursemaids I'd heard go by, since all I'd managed to see were some faceless white eggs rolling only along 2 yards away. They were more and more convinced. "There he is," they shouted. My own conviction grew firmer. I was ready. "I'll do my best," I say. By dint of believing, I began to see, poorly but better. "Your father is waiting for you. Go quick, quick, quick," they shouted, sure of themselves. Out of prudence and obedience, I began to run. And while I ran, I had time to think that if my father was waiting for me, it wasn't because I'd said it, but rather I'd said it because I'd felt him coming. I ran for a long time because I didn't see well. But as I was full of confidence, I let myself be led by instinct. I went by a bench full of maids. They were clapping and saying, "Go, there he is, you can see him, it's him, over there, sitting on the slope, it's him." I didn't see, but I believed the maids. Plus, there was a little black on the white. I reached the slope. Borne along by eagerness, hope, belief, fatigue, curiosity, I flung myself down, arms wide open and eyes too. I was flat on my stomach on the slope, which wasn't white but ochre, close up. To find him, I started to crawl, arms flung wide so as to cover the greatest possible surface. I was a bit upset with him for not coming to meet me, but he must have been upset I was taking so long. I was so busy with my crawling that I didn't hear the silence right to the end. Also, I took a certain pleasure in feeling the earth rub against my stomach and my organs. Finally, I saw the black close up. I jumped on it, pushed by every cell of my body with all the force of my innocence, and I squeezed the fat, black-covered knees of a strange nursemaid. "I've got him," she cried, opening her thighs, and I fell inside. A big laugh rocked the earth. They all laughed hard. I felt a sudden chagrin. I should so have liked the maids to gather me. If I was them, I would have. The one I was underneath laughed so fatly that she crackled and farted from everywhere. She was a big, fat nursemaid. I felt really sorry for myself. Between the thighs, there was nothing. I believed I saw a white bone, but I didn't believe anymore. Besides, nothing mattered to me. I couldn't complain even. I was fine even. and in a while I was better. Under the knees I could see the graininess of the earth, and I felt I was in a familiar place. Me too, I wanted to laugh to be like them, but it didn't happen. So I listened to them all, a long laugh, now and then a bomb, but maybe this was the war's laughter. The next day it was still laughing. Habit, rest, earth, rest, habit, earth, rest, fewer ideas, no time at all except the earth's time, no more feelings except one, I hate the maids. From time to time some distractions like listening to the bombs, peeping between the maids' thighs, or better, when there was a chance to steal a child from them, cut off one paw before giving it back, or make a curious little 3-year-old girl eat a snail. That's good for a laugh. And an occupation. Reflect upon my origins, since no father for me, no anybody, on the contrary, everybody against me. Unless my destiny be the proof of the existence of the father, but that I won't know till the end. In the beginning, I didn't know it was the beginning. I'd never seen him, didn't want to see him. He had put me there, a keeper told me, therefore I wasn't unaware of it, but this knowledge was just a condensation of words from the side of other people's mouths. In my opinion, the garden and I were more closely connected than the keeper and I. And at times, I was even sure the garden and I were made of the same substance. Sand and earth rubbed my bones, mosses, ferns, violets, and strelitzia sprouted from my skin, stretched out my limbs. In springtime, I let the caterpillars stride over me in rusty, soft processions, and when they made moving rings around my spread fingers, my skin had the stiffness of bark. I liked the sand a lot more than my own skin. One day I fell. I had my hands full of sand I didn't want to let go of. Crazy, the keepers would say, whereas sand, there was more of it than all the hands of all the men of all the earth could use. But I loved it. Is it that people let go of what they love because there are other objects? And who'd had given me back the same handful? Who'd have reassured me I'd have the same sensation of complete and utter happiness with other grains? Don't they know happiness is composed precisely of the unique conjunction of thousands of irreplaceable grains cupped in a single hand, so that one doesn't know who does the hugging, whether it's the hand or the sand? That's why I was so careful not to lose the happiness I'd achieved at the end of a long day of groping, during which I had taken, weighed, shaken, thrown back dozens of handfuls of grains, of which only the last had given me with the same feeling of joy. That's why I fell with a brutal and mineral speed and slammed into the ground in 3 different spots with the right parietal bone, because I tried to raise my head, with my elbows pointed forward, with my hands clapped over my stomach, and with my knees. From the shock, one of my knees split. Once I was flat on my right side, I must have slept a while, and the sun was shining into my left eye at a 45-degree angle to the earth when I saw it next. During my absence, I kept hold of my sand. This could have been on purpose or not, but I never let go when I love. It was late. I felt I ought to get up. I had to go on living. I looked myself over. I saw myself rather poorly. I see people poorly, whereas I perceive differences of caliber, edge, shine, weight between 2 or 3 grains of sand. I saw myself poorly, but I was used to moving and touching myself. I knew how to recognize myself. With my fingers, I even saw myself well. I was having trouble moving. I was tired. I didn't rule out a touch of laziness. Finally, some kind of sticky stuff had come out of my knee, and for the time being, I was sticking to the ground. The blood kept me from moving and thinking. I trickled a little of my sand on it, and the rest on my leg. The earth smelled good. A few ants were stuck in the blood on my leg, but they still waved their antennae. I munched 4 or 5 of them, 4 or 5 bombs, and tumbled by mistake into the garden. Everyone shouted, there they are, each in turn. The maids run the fastest. They ran over me so fast, I didn't have time to look between the thighs. At this speed, I saw only an enormous thigh with 100 feet. The keepers were running, got embarrassed, stopped, ran. I felt them go by, especially those who were running, looking over their shoulders and giving me a jab in the knee, which shook off the sand. Finally, the whole world went by, except me. A second later, a bomb fell on top of what I thought was my navel. I leapt. In the old days, I'd have even been scared. But now, I knew it was me, the garden. I was the garden. I was inside. I was made of priceless diamonds, and I had no name. Earth, earth, I cried. So that was the first real garden. Maybe I'll read an excerpt of a book that has quite recently appeared in England under the name of Philippine, and which also deals with gardens. This time there are two gardens. One is my eternal, perennial garden, the military circle, and the other one is its twin. The twin you will find in the extraordinary novel of Du Maurier, Georges Du Maurier, which is called Peter Ibbotson. Maybe you remember Peter Ibbotson. And maybe you remember that Peter Ibbotson takes place between gardens, between a garden in Paris, in Auteuil, where actually Proust was born, exactly at the same place. And the same garden, the same twin garden, on the other side of the channel, somewhere near London. And these gardens are the sets, the architecture of an encounter between life and death, between love and forgetfulness, and between freedom and imprisonment. Now, I've told you, and you certainly have read, more than in France, of course, Peter Ibbotson, but just listen and remind yourself of the spelling of Peter Ibbotson, and you'll realize that inside Peter Ibbotson there is an anagram for P-R-I-S-O-N. So, I was reading, I was walking along Rue du Cercle Militaire simultaneously with sentences singing by my side, colors of geraniums and orange trees. An extraordinarily tall gate thrust up its stiff spires in front of me. We were in Oran, Algeria, at the starting point. The light from the felicitous past has a clarity which no actual incident can pollute. And never has the gate been so monumental and authoritarian. No garden without gate. I recognized it for what it had always been and would be until the end. The sign of my destiny, the gate, the portal, the bars, and all the distance and separation from the world, which cannot be measured in kilometers, in the narrow, inflexible thickness of those bars. Am I inside? Am I outside? This is our question. And my trees, my slim, elegant acacias, my first loves, my magnolias, my medley seducing mimosas, they stretch out their arms to me. My young, odorous Orpheuses from Oran, always already powerless. I adore you, I said, and the glass always already separates us. I can see them telling me regretfully that they cannot tell me the secret. Their beautiful pursed lips sketch all of the words, but the window pane, the invisible transparent substance which cuts out the sound, thwarts our voices, pains our lives. We see ourselves, one another, voiceless. It's torture. I want to enter, I must enter, I want to pass into the side of trees which stretch out to me the passionate, powerless arms of my father leaving us, which I stretched out, oh powerful powerlessness, to my father, while the distance resounded increasingly strongly between us. I look for the hole in the pane, the passport for the portal. If I'm not granted the right, I will turn myself into a cat, pass through the bars. Everything calls me. Words mock at me. The other day I ran to throw myself at the necks of trees. The tree over there, thin, upright, and I crushed on to bars. How naive and passionate we are in the garden, where in its finest attire, sown with nasturtiums and convolvulus, girt with wisterias and jasmines, the promised prison awaits us. Its behemoth jaws gaping. Gardens guard themselves. Guard from guarding. I am the result of an adorable and absolutely impenetrable garden which has initiated me into the mystery of confinement in paradise. No entry. Thou shalt not enter. I did not enter. We did not enter. One fine morning, I entered the magic circle. The portal made way. I believed I entered. I believed I was inside. The gates being cleared, I doubtless had to find myself inside. I did not find myself there. I was inside and I was not. It's a nightmare, I said to myself. I was fully awake and I was in a nightmare. No matter how objectively I was inside, I had never been so arrested, so much a stranger in the midst of a strange land, yet I felt mentally uneasy. Odors of geraniums and orange trees were speaking to me, yet I was repelled, chased away, instead of my name another name, instead of Go Pasquier, Peter Ibbotson, instead of Hélène, Jew, instead of paths lined with trees so dear, forests of boughs. I have already written all this. Thank you.
Thank you so very, very much. I have now a few questions, and then we will open it to the floor for all your questions to Hélène. Maybe I've got lots of questions about Philippines, your extraordinary new book. But before that, I wanted to ask you maybe a little bit more about the beginnings. And somehow the idea of entering a garden is very important in many of your works. And I wanted to ask you about some maybe epiphany moments which you would remember of gardens you entered and maybe which brought you to writings.
Actually, it's all about epiphanies, really. Or if you want, I mean, the first piece I read is almost allegorical. But it is, I think, not only my allegory, but our allegory. That is, we all want to get inside the garden. And particularly, of course, foreigners, particularly those who feel they are exiles. And when I say that, I don't mean that they come from foreign countries only, but because so many people are born foreign and are forever unavowed or unrecognized exiles. And of course, being an exile, either it's comfortable, it happens. I mean, now and then it can be very comfortable. You can have, on the contrary, a feeling of home, of being at home in exile. Most of the time you want to get inside, and you want to get inside the promised garden. So, since I think the time now is resounding with experiences that are quite analogous to those I experienced when I was a little child. I think I'll tell you anecdotes but they are of course symbolical from my childhood. As I said, I was born in Oran in Algeria, which was a colony. It was a French colony. And it was based, the foundation of this country was racism, exclusion, almost apartheid, colonialism, of course, between the different sections of the inhabitants. I can't even say citizens, because they were citizens, they were all French. The non-French didn't exist. They were, of course, the majority, but they had no rights. And there was a kind of, near the place I lived, there was that the magic tent, the magic circle, le cercle militaire, a garden along which I would walk and dream, because for me it represented paradise. But it was forbidden. It was forbidden of course, to Arabs and to Jews. So I never thought that I, as a Jew, would ever get inside the garden, but I would look through the bars. I would walk and look through the bars. I was 2 or 3. But exclusions were manifold in Algeria. That is, the Arabs were considered as the almost slave mass of people. The Jews had been ejected from French nationality by the regime that was collaborationist, that was collaborating with Hitler. So Jews were without nationality, without identity, which for me was a moment of happiness, because then I thought that I could recognize myself in this recognized non-identity, which allowed me to then feel closer to those who were born from the Algerian earth, from the red Algerian earth, the Arabs. But then the war broke, and my father, who was a doctor, but who was enrolled in the army, and it was a kind of visa. Suddenly the garden opened. And as he was a physician, he was a lieutenant in the army. As a lieutenant, he was allowed to go into the forbidden garden. So in I went, and since I was so tiny, I thought I had reached paradise. But every day, I was looking for paradise, and I felt that it was always vanishing. I couldn't, except for catching handfuls of sand, I had no feeling of paradise. On the contrary, it smelled like hell. And it took me quite a time to understand what was happening. I was inside, and yet I had never been as outside as when I had gone inside. Above my head were young, fair-haired children on swings. They would swing like that, they were like fair angels, and spit on my head. And I didn't understand why, so I thought, I don't have the key, I must have the shibboleth. Something is missing, something that makes for my not being related to them. For me, it was complete mystery. And then I heard words fly like that. And I heard the word stamp. I thought, stamp, that's the shibboleth. They want stamps. So I shouted from below, I have stamps, I receive stamps every day. And that was true, because my whole German family, my mother was German. My whole German family was everywhere disseminated in the world or in concentration camps. And we would receive mail from all over the world. So stamps, were the most ordinary thing. And the moment I said that sentence, I have stamps, and if you need stamps, I'll bring stamps to you. A young, fair-haired girl, radiant, fair-haired girl, shouted at me, liar! So I was, of course, seized with, I didn't understand and I was terrified. And so she gave me an explanation. Liar, all Jews are liars. So, and this is how my philosophical life started. Because immediately I was in a double bind. I thought, first of all, I didn't know I was a Jew. So I was told that. So, and the definition was that. The definition was also that my feeling that inside was outside, although I was inside, was absolutely glaring. And the philosophical emotion was that I thought, now, if I bring stems, I shall betray my newfound race or people or whatever, the name of which I had just heard, because I will humiliate myself and dishonor my kin. If I don't bring the stems, I shall be the proof that Jews are liars. So there were bars everywhere. You know, I found myself with bars everywhere. And I must say that the garden was full of scent. It smelled so lovely. And it was full of life. I would crawl, creep, be one with the insects. I was an ant. But with humans, it was extremely difficult. So I went out of the garden. I was alone. I was 3. And I went back home. And what happened next is what I've been writing then for so many books. The answer is still...
And that leads us also, because you mentioned the inside and the outside of the garden. When I spoke to Edouard Glissant in one of my conversations with him, who obviously was also very involved in a Algerian liberation struggle, post-colonial liberation struggle, Edouard was mentioning the importance of gates. And when I reread So Close, I realized the importance of that in your writing. To quote you, by what right did I forget that I didn't have the right? I was born with garden forbidden. Nothing changes, which is very much what you've just told us. So somehow finding yourself at the gate of the garden and encountering the situation, I think, politicizes the notion of the hortus conclusus, which we have here of Peter Zumthor. And I was somehow very curious, because also in Philippines, you write, gardens guard themselves, guard from guarding. I'm the result of an adorable and absolutely impenetrable garden, which has initiated me into the mystery of confinement. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about this political hortus conclusus now, because when actually for this marathon today we invited Jimmy Durham and Maria Teresa Alves, both artists who have worked a lot with gardens. They actually could not come because, as on many previous occasions, there were many problems with English customs. So I'd like to just read here an email from Jimmy Durham, which underlines that, from a few weeks ago, where Jimmy Durham told us that he could not enter the UK. Also, we both, and he means Maria Teresa Alves and himself, Jimmy Durham, also we both would have liked to participate in the Garden Marathon, especially as Maria Teresa has worked on various projects involving plants. We have both had much trouble recently entering Great Britain and have decided, due to rough border handling, will not return. So it was very shocking to receive this email. And I was just wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit about that and about the now.
Well, I'm not surprised, because it's, after all, if our friends, they were prevented from coming to the so-called, what stands for a garden, that is England. By the way, you know, when I heard our hostess introduce the notion of garden, I thought it's interesting indeed that England has to do with gardens. That of course is a subject in itself, the botanical aspect of the English spirit, which is most important. That is to grow things, you know, and not necessarily to uproot them. Although I have no illusion, of course, about Britain and what it does with foreigners. It resembles more and more France now. So, but I think that, first of all, as a writer, of course, I'm interested in words and in the growth of words, in their etymology, in the roots of words. And of course, gardens, I mean, it's a treasure. The word garden, as has been said earlier, is so interesting. It's the same almost everywhere in the world, and it goes back to our ancestor languages, to Indo-Iranian, for instance. For instance, imagine that we owe Iran the word garden. Iran, which is totally forbidden, always. So I think it's interesting when we use the tools, the artistic tools, language, in a literary way, of course, or whatever, painting, sculpture, architecture. We always actually are repeating in a different way, modulating differently, the almost initial traumas of all societies and civilizations. That is always expelling people, crushing them, forbidding them, throwing them into prison, as Wei experienced recently, etc. The moment you want to, or you imagine that you're entitled, simply as being born, as being human, that you're entitled to enjoy life, you're immediately repressed. Because what I want to underline is that it's not only, as I said, those who come from the outside and ask for admittance who are banished and repressed, but of course on the spot you can be repressed. Whenever you want to be free, it becomes dangerous. Really free, not simply, you know, taking the bus or something. No, when you want to express something totally different, when you are outside of the norm, you become immediately a public enemy. And this is why it's so important that artists elaborate ties, think of one another, do what you do, because I admire very much what you do here. It's really remarkable. The fact that, you know, you weave ties with people around the world. Of course, it's essential.
Now, one more question I had was about your garden discussion with Derrida, because when I called you for the first time to discuss the marathon, and we must thank Donatien Grau, who is also here, for having put us in touch and made that contact. We talked about your dialogues with Derrida, and you said you wanted to talk a little bit more about this. And in So Close, but also in Ila from 1980, you talk about Alger's garden, the Jardin d'Essai, and about your many conversations you had about Jacques Derrida. And I was wondering, because the Jardin d'Essai is a real place, but it's also an imaginary place, it's a dream place. You said it's the dream, to quote you, of the most beautiful garden in the world. So I was somehow, or maybe Derrida said that actually. I'm not sure if you or Derrida said that, but you both somehow referred to it as the most beautiful garden in the world. So I wanted to ask you to maybe tell us a little bit more about this Jardin d'Essai.
Yes, the Jardin d'Essai is a botanical garden, but it's, of course, this is basic. It is indeed the most beautiful garden in the world, but of course it also has its huge history, which is colonial. That is, it's a very, very big park that was created by the French colonialists near the sea in Algiers, in order to experiment, because essai means experiment, les essais de montagne, it's experiment, to experiment with all kinds of botanical species. And since it now has about 200 years, it grew into magnificent kinds of trees, and it's a kind of monument of, and it's very ambivalent. It's the monument of an Orientalist dream, but it's also a monument of for all those scientists who, as you know, in the history of colonialism, would follow the emperors, etc., who would conquer half of the world, and those scientists would profit by the war to do research, invent new shapes, select new or unknown grains, etc., exactly as Darwin did when he went on the Beagle. When he went to Patagonia, he did exactly the same, you know. So Le Jardin d'Essai was both a success as regards botanical research and a kind of dream, as in the 1001 Nights. And when I was a kid, I was brought there at first by my father, and I couldn't believe my eyes. The trees, etc., were so old and so majestic. They were beyond humanity, and it was open at that time. So actually, when we met, Derrida was born in Algiers. I was born in Oran. The first thing we spoke about.
When did you meet? When and how did you meet for the first time?
Not in Algeria. Yeah. That's, you see. Actually, we went to the same school preparatory to La Même Hippocagne. I don't know how one says that in English. You know, after, well, it's something special in France.
So you went to university, or was before?
No, it was not in the university. It was to prepare École Normale Supérieure. Yeah. But we had 7 years difference. So I followed the same path without knowing him, of course. And we met in Paris, actually, as two former Algerians who felt extremely ill at ease in France, who were extremely upset by the environment, the political, the academic environment, and by also what was still reigning in France. That was the idea of colonialism, because it was, of course, it was just after the end of the War of Algeria. So we met in 1963, but I had met him first, as he has himself legendarized somehow the first meeting, because I was only 18 when I saw him first, and that was at La Sorbonne. I had just arrived from Algeria. I knew nothing about France, and I went inside a big university hall in La Sorbonne. I was like a little mouse, and I did not even approach. It was a huge amphitheater, and I sat at the back, and up in front there was a back turned to me, of course, and that back was speaking, and speaking about thinking about death. That was the subject of the lecture he was giving to graduate, actually. And for me, it was as if I were hearing the voice of my own soul, because it was simply answering my own thoughts. And a couple of years later, I got in touch with him because I thought he's the only person, when I was 22, I thought he's the only person who will understand why I'm now working on Joyce. So you see, there are different ramifications. And we became very close. But at first, I think that we communicated very easily because we were damaged in the same way. But we didn't speak about that. We were not interested in complaining. We were interested in conquering the French language. He himself, you know, in monolingualism, he even said that he wanted to master the French language, to be the master, to beat it, to rape it, you know. He wanted a revenge on the French language.
And it's also very moving because in Reprints you say that Derrida and you came from the same garden. And then, if one thinks more about the Jardin d'Essai, you say that actually you wished almost to keep it as a sort of a personal paradise in form of a garden of literary essays. And that made me think, actually, or made me wonder if you had ever thought about your own garden, your project of your own garden, because we spoke a lot about Ian Hamilton Finlay. Julia Peyton-Johns mentioned at the beginning Ian Hamilton Finlay and his commission for the Serpentine Gallery, the stone circle outside the gallery, which also in the breaks you were all invited to visit. And obviously Ian Hamilton Finlay as an artist invented Little Sparta, one of the most extraordinary gardens ever. And so I was somehow wondering if you had any realized or unrealized garden projects of your own.
May I just add one word about Jardin d'Essai, and then I'll answer. Because actually, you know, if Jardin d'Essai works or worked for us, it's also because it's a set of signifiers. When you hear Jardin d'Essai in French, you can't make it out by ear. So it has to do with the difference with an A that Derrida speaks about. That is, you hear Jardin d'Essai, maybe Jardin, garden, of the letter C, the seeds, of seeds, or of say it is, etc., etc. I mean, there are a number of homophones or homonyms that come along the idea of botanical gardens. And of course, when you say Jardin d'Essai and you're a poet, it is so poetical that the garden is also a garden of letters. And of course, we, Derrida and I, we would exchange in this way, exchanging literally through signifiers, etc. Now, to come back to the garden, first of all, I know that through time and years, I realized that I stick to the garden desire. I keep gardening wherever I am. And even when I'm in, first of all, I write in a place where there is a kind of modest but ideal garden, because it's totally wild and it's also peopled. It's full of animals, which is very important for me. And even in Paris, where I have no garden, I garden my balconies, and it's overflowered. And I need it. I know that I need, because it's really, as all people who garden know, it is a way of musically accompanying life, you know, having the cycles, realizing how we are structured along cycles, how we die and resurrect, etc. And that is with gardening. It's so important to feel that. But as regards an ideal garden, I would say that there are two that come to my mind, because of course I react to your question. I've never thought about that. Mm-hmm. But if I would have two ideal gardens. One is actually a cemetery. Because finally, you know, I've lost so many people I love that I have come to terms with cemeteries. And I dream of the ideal cemetery. Because they're so horrid in France, you know. They kill you. Cemeteries kill you. They kill the dead. You know, you go into a French cemetery and you see the hatred of the living for the dead. It's just awful. Whereas there are other countries, particularly, for instance, when I was in Algeria, the Arabs, you know, they just stroke the earth. You have nothing, just a little piece of porcelain or something. And that, for me, is something essential. So it's important. And then, of course, it's the book. I mean, what I imagine would be the ideal garden would be the book where, I mean, the book of which I always dream, and which would be a book of hospitality to all species, genres that are alive, and of course, including the dead, and where animals and vegetables exchange with us. I've just read, and maybe you've read it too, because it was yesterday in a French paper, there was an article, a paper from a biologist, a very famous biologist in Paris, who simply pointed to the fact that human beings are vegetalized, that whatever they absorb, they eat, etc., modifies completely their biological structure. Of course, we know that since we eat, but it's much more than that. It inscribes, it writes something inside us. So it also writes life and death, war, destruction, or on the contrary, resurrection.
And this idea these two wonderful projects. The second one, in terms of the book, leads us to a whole other set of questions I have about Philippines, which is your extraordinary, one of your most recent books, published also in English, which has so much to do with the garden. And there is actually a big emphasis on dreams. You write, in reality, they dream. Reality is the dream. The dream is the true reality. You also say in an interview I read, in my work, my luck is to have a writing partner who is none other than the dream. And as in our whole research, I always took notes whenever we have conversations. The dream garden was the garden most mentioned to us by all interlocutors we had. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the dream and Philippines.
About the dream. Anyway, I'm a certain type of writer who writes with the help of dreams, which is more current than one usually knows or likes to acknowledge. For instance, if you read Proust, it's full of dreams. It's full of dreams, and not only dreams that are there as dreams retold, but dreams that have been placed and interpreted as parts of the work itself. And so many, Rimbaud, for instance, half of his poems are dreams, former dreams, elaborated dreams. So I think dreams for me are the speaking earth. It's really, I originate from dreams, and also they bring to me, and thank dreams, language, and not only all languages, language in images, which is really the wealth for somebody who writes. Or I would say, if I used Freudian words, metaphors and metonymy, which make sense. So, the persons you allude to who tell you about dream gardens, I suppose they're all descendants, which I think is of course quite logical, from the first dream. The first dream ever in mankind is the dream of a garden, of course. It's the dream, and it's the dream lost, and I even think that probably the Garden of Eden has stemmed from a dream, because the way you lose it, the way it vanishes, is exactly the same as the way a dream, which is a whole world, which brings such, such an addition of worlds to us, which transforms the idea that we have a universe into the fact that we have multiverses. When you're in a dream, you have everything. You're the most powerful being alive, and it's finished, and it disappears, and you've lost everything. And my idea is that it's exactly what happened. That is, those who wrote the history of Paradise Lost probably were dreamers, and probably the idea of God is also a signifier coming from dreams.
It's interesting also you mentioned the multiverse, because we show here as part of the marathon a film of David Deutsch, who is a great quantum physicist who wrote Fabric of Reality and very much connects to multiverse. And one of the things which I found a lot in interviews you gave about dreams is that you call dreams textual energy, our personal nuclear energy. You said in one interview, you said, I'm a dreamer, I was born a dreamer, I even remember dreams I had when I was 3. So I was just wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about this dream as a nuclear energy.
Because it's something, all dreamers, all those who, we, as you know, all people dream. Then there is a difference between those people who keep their dreams, who are, and those who lose the dreams. So I want, of course, teach anything to anybody. Dreams are much more powerful than, I mean, they come from us and they're a million times more powerful than we are. So it's an experience which is absolutely, first of all, it's wonderful, and it's also necessary, because it's good for the ego, because there are moments during the night when you're a giant, you know. And it's also very good for the need for humility, because the giant becomes a dwarf in a split second. But it is true that what happens in dreams, and that is why I was quoting poets, the power of Rimbaud comes, the energy, the invention, the capacity for inventing new formulas that have never ever been used in the French language. And there are French, but there are new French, comes from dreams. And this is why I say, at the same time, one becomes very humble, because one knows that it's not me who has written that, it's the dreamer. We're always behind. I feel as if we're always, you know, running behind a power who is much, much more gifted and much more intelligent than I am.
Now, another thing which I found fascinating about Philippines is the notion of the telepathic garden. Because you say that when you started writing the book, you thought it was called either telepathic garden or letepathic garden. So I was somehow wondering if you can tell us a little bit about telepathy or letepathy.
Yes. It's a word I've made up recently, because of course we need to make up words all the time. But they shouldn't be, of course, pure noise. It's not sound and fury, no, it's meaning. Anagrams are very helpful always. As I said, for instance, I realized when I read Peter Ibbotson that it contained the word prison. And if we don't realize that, it doesn't matter, because it works anyway. That is, when you read Peter Ibbotson and you haven't realized, you haven't recognized that there is prison everywhere. The letters of prison are everywhere. You still feel, you still receive the influence, the impact, the magic of the subterranean prison that is everywhere. So telepathy works in a way, in this way. First of all, Peter Ibbotson is a novel that is inspired by something that is telepathy. That is communication through means, between beings, of course, through means that are not directly with the phone. After all, the phone is only the crystallization, or the coming to being materialized of the dream of telepathy. The telephone has always existed. That is, for the Greeks, for Aeschylus or Sophocles, there was already the telegraph. You could communicate through telegraph. So this idea, this need to communicate at distance, this tele-desire, this desire for telecommunicating has always been there for all human beings. And I would even say, maybe it starts with the umbilical cord, after all. You know, Joyce made a joke about that. He says that the first telephone number is 00001, and that you use your umbilical cord to call God. So it's really inaugural for all human beings. Now, in this novel, which in this book, in my book, Philippines, which evokes people who succeeded in communicating in spite of being totally separated, since the hero is jailed for life, and he will die actually in prison, and the heroine is outside, and yet they meet regularly every night and have a life, a kind of other life, which uses the channel of dreams to achieve itself. So they actually communicate through what Du Maurier has called true dreaming, which of course seems to point to the fact that there are dreams that are not true. But true dreaming has magic powers. It doesn't work, so there are all kinds of conditions for people to be able to use true dreaming to telecommunicate. And the conditions are, of course, all affective, psychical. They have to do with the fact that you have to telecommunicate from heart to heart, that the condition is pure love, eternal love, a love that cannot be corrupted ever. So, of course, it happens very, very rarely, but does happen. I imagine that those who have dear ones imprisoned, which is very often the case nowadays, some of them maybe are blessed with that possibility. As for l'ethépathe, of course, it's not simply a way of playing with words, but it refers to the Lethe, which is, as you know, the river in Homer that the dead and the living also, because some real living heroes could go over, the river that the dead have to cross over to reach the kingdom of Hades, and they would both go over the river and drink of the water of the Lethe, which would bring complete oblivion. And which it's very strong if you imagine that. It means that the dead need oblivion not to suffer too much of being dead. So they drink of the Lethe, and if you want to come back to life, which is something that almost never happens, but they try, then you have to counter-drink the water of the Lethe. But so if I think in terms of Lethe, it's also because this river is so mythical. At the same time, it's such a powerful image. The idea that you have to go through those that kind of chemistry of the soul, that you have to drink a kind of beneficial poison, and it has been, of course, it has recurred in many literary works, beginning with Shakespeare, who in Hamlet calls to the Lethe, where the poor ghost of King Hamlet, he's on the wharf, you know, and he's just near at the angle of the possibility to haunt nights, and the fate that obliges him to go back to the dead.
Thank you so very much. It's now the moment to open it to the floor. Thank you, Hélène. Thank you very, very much. Are there questions, urgent questions for Hélène from the floor? Yeah, I have a question here.
Pardon?
Is the Jardin d'Essai still open?
Actually, yes. That is, and when I went back to Algeria, actually 5 years ago, it was closed, and I was very unhappy about it. But it was closed only for rehabilitation. They were trying to, it had been damaged, it had been abandoned, but now, I mean, this year it's open, yes. But you can find it on internet. It's extraordinarily beautiful, and it's full of primeval trees, really.
Are there more questions for Hélène?
Correctly. So, I mean, speaking about the metaphor of the river and the oblivion, do you regard it as a communication despite the oblivion, or a communication with the dead? I mean, I wasn't sure I grasped the meaning of telepathy as in relation to telepathy.
It's communication with the dead, but it doesn't mean anything. It means that there is no separation between the living and the dead. Okay. It's an allegory, of course. So, but what it points to is that the dead are dead only if you tell them that they're dead. You know, they can be alive inside yourself. So it's what is extraordinarily beautiful in Homer is the fact that there are concrete features, figures, to illustrate the mysteries of the human soul. As you know, the heroes, the characters in Homer, travel in all countries, and also Ulysses, and later in Virgil, Aeneas, they both go to Hades, they go to the dead. And of course they are privileged, but the dead expect visits, you know, but they can expect visits for 1,000 years without having any visit. That is, of course, a way of pointing to our terrible proneness to forgetting and wiping out. And we can also treat living beings as dead, you know. If we disregard them completely, they're dead.
Any other urgent questions? Question here.
Your book of hospitality for all species, could you say what form that might take?
Oh, no, I can't. Actually, it's such a dream book, you know, that I'm still waiting for the dream that will start writing it, because it must be so huge. And since, as Hans Ulrich has just pointed to, you know, when I was very young, we were still thinking in terms of universe. Now we know that we have to adapt to the multiverse. So I'm waiting for the multi-dream to give me an idea, the first chapter.
I have a very last question. I wanted to ask you, Rainer Maria Rilke wrote this amazing little book, which is advice to a poet, to a young poet. I was wondering what would be your advice in 2011?
To a young poet?
To a young poet, to a young writer.
Huh. You know, he wrote a little book.
Yeah.
So it's important. If I were to give an advice, I would have to write a book. You cannot give one advice, you know. What you can give is a kiss or a blessing, but an advice.
So that's maybe another one.
Or just don't lie. Don't lie. Don't lie. It's very difficult.
Hélène, thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.